Well, I am here with two friends, Iain Morrison.
Hey.
Hi.
Hello.
Came all the way from Scotland to talk about communist poems of the American communist poems of the
I didn't know it at the
1930s.
time, but I'm certainly getting an education.
Yeah, well,
Communist
no, it's
poems
so
of the
great to have you
1930s.
here.
Oh,
And let
thank
me
you.
just say also, or ask you a question. You know, the radical left poetry of the American 1930s has in you a kind of cognate interest about, about poetry of your own time.
Yeah.
Can you say, you can't go on about this, but what's a brief response to that assumption that you care about this kind of topic?
There's definitely poets with whom I'm in kinship society with, who are really trying to work out what a political poetry is now. And in the UK, it's caught up in all these kind of debates as to whether the language needs to be complex or direct, or
Right.
Where does violence sit within the writing, and
Yes.
how does political violence equate to or be bolstered by or kind of counteracted by literary violence.
Yeah,
quote
yeah,
unquote.
yeah. Well said. Which makes me turn to John Hoel, who's come all the way from Massachusetts to join us. Not all the way from Scotland, but... and John, you have an interest in this whole topic, and the question that Iain raised is a question that is related to Kenneth Fearing, among others, whom we're going to talk about, and other poems of this period. The question is, should a proletarian poem be understood by a mass of people? And mass is the right word. And that is the big question. And it's a huge question for you to answer briefly by way of introduction, but how does this question work out in the poetry itself? Could these poets go for simplicity, and would that work?
I think so. There's a horrible mistake made with proletarian literature that comes up a lot in the criticism of 30s literature, which is that proletarian literature is simplistic, that it's written in a way that can be read by the masses, and the notion that simplistic language is bad is sort of suggestive to me that then Woody Guthrie is bad, and if Woody Guthrie is bad, then Bob Dylan is bad, and all populism is bad. And populism is tricky, but we shouldn't dismiss things outwardly when there is examples of social poetry
Right.
that's really good.
Right. And this is a big question in the 30s. Argument in its most binaristic and false sense. The false dichotomy is, if you're a modernist in the teens and 20s, let's say a Steinian modernist, or William Carlos Williams of a book like Spring and All, right, where the chapters are headed upside down, and all this typographical experimentation, and you get to the 30s and you want to be simpler, do you abandon the modernist techniques? And I have written extensively about this, as you know, and the answer is not so simple. The answer was provided to this question, a false answer was provided in the 1950s at a time of anti-communist conservative consolidation in the arts. And so the answer was, the communists were wrong, the modernists were right in a tame sort of way. And that erased the difficulty of poets like, let's say, Kenneth Fearing,
Yeah.
who wrote an accessible and hilarious, in some ways, playful, gamified, but also complicated and modernist kind of poetry.
Absolutely. And he, it's funny. I think a lot of his legacy is not necessarily forgotten because of his politics, which is the case with all of his contemporaries. They're all forgotten because of the fact that they were communists or socialists. That's the reason that they're not anthologized. The reason that I think Fearing is overlooked is not that. I think it's because Ginsberg exists. Because Ginsberg
Who loved Fearing.
Right. But with Ginsberg's popularity, Fearing is, as a progenitor to the beats, is doing beat poetry,
Right.
and arguably better, but arguably. But because it's so similar, why would you, if you're doing an anthology of 20th century poetry, why would you include Kenneth Fearing when you already have to dedicate a whole chapter to Ginsberg and Joan Kiger?
That is so right. And of course, there's a whole generational problem, and not to mention that Fearing also got dinged in the 50s because he had been associated with the left. Yeah. So what we're going to do now is we're going to look at a poem by Fearing in this anthology called New Masses, an anthology of the Rebel 30s. And it was edited by Joe North, who was a communist editor of the New Masses magazine, which is being celebrated here. But this is published by Penguin.
Radical press.
Yes, right. In the 70s, I believe. So there's a poetry section of it. And I just want to say a personal anecdote before we open this book and go to a poem by Kenneth Fearing. And that is that when I'm so old that when I first went to my college library to look for the New Masses magazine, actually copies of the New Masses, either on microfilm or paper copies, it wasn't there. It was a major magazine of the 1930s and actually became Masses in Mainstream in the late 1940s, and it wasn't there. So I asked the reference librarians why that was, because they had a record of it earlier, because Colgate University goes way back and the library was very old. It had been there, but it had been purged, as it had been at most college libraries. The New Masses was disappeared. And so it became difficult for me as a graduate student at another institution to decide to write about the literary left, because literally the research materials were impossible to find. And that is a way to get rid of a whole swath of literary history.
Wow.
Yeah. And the librarians didn't take sides. They just didn't correct the elimination later. Okay, how about that?
That's an amazing story.
So this is a poem called Dirge.
And this is an act of reclamation.
This is repression followed by recovery. Right? Repression and recovery. So this is a poem published first in the New Masses magazine called December 18th, 1934, right before the Popular Front kicks in. So this is a sectarian mode. And it's called Dirge. And it's clearly a what the heck's going to happen now that our bank accounts are worth nothing poem. It's very famous among Fearing. It's probably his most famous poem. And I'm going to read it as Ginsbergian-ish as I can, or as Fearing-ish as I can. Okay, here it goes. Dirge. 1, 2, 3 was the number he played, but today the number came 3, 2, 1. Bought his carbide at 30 and it went to 29. Had the favorite at Havana, but the track was slow. Oh, executive type, would you like to drive to a floating power knee action silk upholstered 6? Wed a Hollywood star? Shoot the course at 58? Draw to the ace king jack? Oh, fellow with a will who won't take no, watch out for 3 cigarettes on the same single match. Oh, Democratic voter born in August under Mars, beware of liquidated rails. Denouement to denouement, he took a personal pride in the certain way he lived his own personal life, but nevertheless they shut off his gas. Nevertheless the bank foreclosed. Nevertheless the landlord called. Nevertheless the radio broke, and 12 o'clock arrived, just once too often. Just the same, he wore 1 gray tweed suit, bought 1 straw hat, drank 1 straight scotch, walked 1 short step, took 1 long look, drew 1 deep breath, just 1 too many, and wow, he died as wow, he lived, going whop to the office and bluey home to sleep, and Biff got married and Bam had children and Oof got fired. Zowie did he live and Zowie did he die. With who the hell are you at the corner of his casket? And where the hell are we going on the right-hand silver knob? And who the hell cares, walking second from the end with an American Beauty wreath from Why the Hell Not, very much missed by the circulation staff of the New York Evening Post. Deeply, deeply mourned by the BMT. Wham, Mr. Roosevelt, pow, Sears Roebuck, awk, Big Dipper, bop, summer rain, bong, Mr. Bong, Mr. Bong, Mr. Bong.
Great reading, yeah.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
All right, I want to just hear the two of you riffing on any thoughts and ideas that you have. John, you first?
This is a very not, this is a very surface level thought that is just the very first thing that pops into my head, but denouement is the name of a different Fearing poem, which is the first one I ever read, my favorite one. And so I think it's funny that he says denouement twice, almost like
it's
advertising.
a great poem too. Highly recommend.
Yeah. Wow, I'm trying to remember. This is off the cuff, so I can't remember who the critic was that was writing about Fearing in the 30s and said that, I think in Poetry magazine, said that Fearing writes these really long, gorgeous lines at the beginning of his poems, and then he spends the rest of the poem ruining it. Which, in this poem, it's sort of, you have these sort of like long lines that are then followed by a whole paragraph.
Ginsbergian.
Yeah, right. And there's just, it's so maximal. It's incredibly colorful, and there's so many interesting images. One too many, maybe.
Yeah, yeah. Iain, first thought?
I'm loving the way that when you read it, it suddenly takes off just at the moment that he decides to kill himself. If that's what's happening, or like
he gets a life.
Yeah, this energy comes in, and it's like, it's almost like one of those like, like time slows down in the moment of death type sort of like I don't know how he kills himself, but it sounds like
he jumps.
He jumps off a what? Off a like.
Yeah, this is a stock market crash poem.
So what's he jumping? So where do you get the jump? He
takes a step. Took one long look,
so
drew one long breath, just one too many. Yeah, probably off a bridge.
Yeah,
out of a window.
Because I get the sense.
Which is a famous way of killing yourself in 1929,
It's
1930.
Because it's all this like boom bang bop ok. It's like, I get a sense of like the violence of whatever landing.
There's a violence of life lived in 1920s, roaring 20s acquisition, right? You got a mortgage, you got your betting here, all the bong, 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 and then there's the bong of death, and it's no difference.
Yeah, but it is different in the poem, because the poem doesn't have all that boom, bang, bosh.
At the beginning.
Yeah, at the beginning, there's just these long lines, and then suddenly, like, almost, well, literally, by the end, it's every second word is this blow, blow, blow. I suppose it's like, is it illustrating a kind of, like, knockout, like, the match, him versus the system, kind of...
Maybe cartoonish, because actually...
Yeah, cartoonish.
Communist critique of the way in which aspiring middle and upper middle class salaried people had to live their lives was almost gamified and cartoonized. These people became jokes.
Cartoon totally makes sense.
Like bow, whap,
pop,
whop.
Yeah. So I just noticed that.
Yeah.
Well, there's also the tone is sort of, to think about like boxing, which is so big. It's big still, but really popular amongst people then. Fearing contemporary Horace Gregory, who, we've talked about. Horace Gregory's most famous poem is about Dempsey the boxer, which is the same time period, I think. And I don't know, there's something like the sort of auctioneer voice of the boxing announcer that's sort of like, pow, wow, sort of, it's very, to me, that's very of that moment of like, talkies are just becoming a thing, and the way that the audio comes across in those kinds of short films or movies are like always in that kind of high energy, like 100 words a minute, the way that I would imagine his, like the reading of it being, it's just so, cartoon's probably better because it has that sort of cartoonish, I don't want to end up a cartoon in a cartoon graveyard.
Yeah.
It's like that, like...
And the way the cartoon kind of lets someone die time and time again, like, so like, Tom and Jerry, they get
bounces
squashed
back
flat,
and gets blown
and then
up
knocks
one more
down.
time.
Wow, he died as wow he lived doesn't feel like we're mourning the loss of life. It's a cartoon. It's the coyote. On the
yes, exactly.
Yeah. And I guess that segues into the way that like he's really not mourned by anyone personal. It's like who the hell are these people around him? Like the circulation staff of the New York, whatever it was, like
trying to deliver a paper to the guy who's dead and can't pay for it.
Yeah.
Well, I have read a lot of poems from the magazines, including New Masses. And no one was writing like this when he started doing this. No one. There is a little Whitman in there, but Whitman's never going to write quite like this. So this is really original, right? And it must be noted that the adaptation of this style for leftist critique of the Depression is a unique contribution by Kenneth Fearing to the whole 1930s poetic literary left. And in that vein, we know that Allen Ginsberg revered Fearing, was interested in Fearing. And so here, when they're carrying the casket, you have, with who the hell are you at the corner of his casket, and where the hell are we going on the right-hand silver knob? Supermarket in California, where are we going? Where are you going tonight, Walt Whitman? Which is a way of saying in that poem, where is America going, right? Where are we headed?
Yeah.
And I think that is by Ginsberg, a real nod back to Fearing.
Yeah. And, for this to have appeared in 1934, I mean, talk about a moment of uncertainty of where the country is going, and where poetry is going too.
Yeah, absolutely.
There's a real sense of fear in the air.
Didn't call him Fearing for nothing.
Yeah.
Iain, this is the first time you read this poem.
It is, yeah.
In what way is it revelatory, if at all?
Well, I think it's seeing these long lines this early. I mean, I know Whitman, but I suppose I really did think of this like Hoel. This was kind of like Ginsberg. So
Pre-Hoel.
Were you saying that on camera earlier about why was Kenneth Fearing left out when you had Ginsberg?
Yeah,
could be known in anthologies later. So I can really see that, and I'm curious as to how it fits in with things like projective verse and the history of those kind of lines and long.
I don't know if the projectivists would have even known of Fearing, but maybe.
Yeah, well, it's just doing it's the Whitmanian thing, the long line, but also the kind of spontaneous bop prosody. It's all
bop is actually a word in here.
Yeah, it's bop in there.
Bop,
yeah,
bop, Summer Rain.
Yeah, well, there you go. So here's your
what
original...
is Summer Rain? Why is Summer Rain in there? We've got Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Sears Roebuck, which is how you would buy things by mail. Then we have Auk, Big Dipper.
Is that like a roller coaster or?
No, I think it's this constellation.
Oh no, Big Dipper. Yeah.
I think. I don't know. Yeah. But Bop Summer Rain, John, what is Summer Rain doing there? Is that just a nod to lyric poetry?
It could be. Yeah, I mean it's a nice final image.
It's a great song by Belinda Carlisle, but that's anachronistic.
Yeah.
It is. Yes,
I mean, this is coming out in December. Summer Rain. Yes. But I guess, it takes a minute. Summer Rain.
The lyric poetry was the best that I could do with
it. It's a lyric cliche, right?
It's kind of a nice little... It's a nice slip in, though, because we've got all this sort of dark comedy. It's like... So... it's a little human moment from him.
Yeah.
At the end here. Summer Rain.
And maybe I would pull it back, because there's a moment I noticed earlier on, which I have a question about, which is when it says in the denouement line, denouement to denouement, he took a personal pride in the certain way he lived his own personal life. So the idea of a personal life that he thinks can somehow be separate and protected from all this market violence, like might be the personal life in which he, stylishly goes around and enjoys the summer rain, or I don't know, like, yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think you have the stock market chart there, down, one big down and another big down, and so you can almost see that. But he took pride in the way that he managed, the depression, and a lot of people had to manage. But nevertheless, even though he took a certain personal pride in surviving the crash and becoming losing value in his portfolio, they still turned off the gas. Right, they still foreclosed him.
Yeah.
It's a very serious literary left moment in this. Maybe too serious.
I think of the way that, like, my older relatives and older family, like, we talk. I'm from a working class Scottish background, and there was a lot of poverty in the way that my mother and father grew up in old mining villages, and they would talk about people being neatly turned out. People who had nothing, like, to no halfpennies to rub together, but still the sense that whether you made a bit of an effort to spruce yourself up with your
one tweed suit and a hat.
Yeah, so it's like I can see that this kind of the idea of personal dignity is.
Yeah, well,
it's under siege.
It looks like this guy got dressed up in his last suit and took a scotch and then killed himself. and jumped off.
It's really sad.
Wearing as much as... Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Hey, let's do just a minute or two of playing out some local references here so that someone reading this poem or watching this video can get... I'll start. Carbide is a reference to the stock of Union Carbide. Right, Union Carbide. So bought his carbide at 30 and it went to 29. Anybody else want to spell out a reference here?
I wanted to, because I like the line, the 3 cigarettes on same single match. Is that like a superstition that don't light 3 cigarettes from the same match?
I don't know the answer, but I'm going to say that it is either a romantic manly trope, of generosity, but I think it's also a depression thing. Like, we got one match, and we're gonna light each other's cigarettes here out on the street. I don't know. Anybody else got a reference? American Beauty. That's the American Beauty rose.
What's the American Beauty rose?
It's a very, very cultivated, big, romantic, symbolic rose.
Okay, gorgeous.
Yes. Any others?
Well, I mean, this is cheating a little bit because you mentioned this. You pointed us to this line before we started recording, but I'm going to go there anyway. Which is after Carbide, the favorite at Havana, but the track was slow. Which is, I think Hemingway immediately, but just the race track as sort of an interesting counter image to.
Yeah, it's betting on the horses, but notice that this is a New York poem. This guy is in New York. He's jumping off the Empire State Building or something, or the Brooklyn Bridge.
Yeah.
But how is it that he's betting on a horse in Havana? It's not legal.
Yeah, through the wire.
Absolutely.
Like
he's playing the numbers in a way.
Like Robert Redford in The Sting.
Exactly. That's exactly it. So he had a favorite at Havana, but the track was slow. He lost. He bet on a horse and it lost. Good.
A horse in Cuba,
in Cuba. In Cuba, right?
Right.
I mean, like, you're not supposed to be able to do that.
Right. Okay.
I mean, now you can, but
yeah, is it well?
Any others? I mean, this is thick with references that one could footnote.
Is the course in 58 golf? Shooting a course in 58?
Yes, absolutely. That's golf. Shoot the course in 58. And the 6, driving a floating power knee action silk upholstered 6. That's six cylinders. It's a powerful car. I don't know what knee action could be. I guess fancy cars. What would you do, Zach? Would you push your knee onto the? There's some kind of clutch. I don't know. Knee action, silk upholstered. Yeah. Any others?
What is the BMT?
That's the subway.
The BMT is the
yes. BMT is an old name for
to the
Brooklyn Metro Transit. BMT. So it was
deeply mourned by they would be the most empathetic. Yeah.
Yes, right. I mean, he's got to put his tokens in there. Yeah. So, I mean, this little exercise is a way of reminding anybody who reads Fearing that there's a lot of social context here, even though it is almost surrealistically comic.
Is there something like about manliness in all of this as well? Is it like an attempt to kind of
mock manliness?
Yeah, I'm curious about that because I mean, there's no. I don't get any sense of like what the female equivalent of this might be.
But he's got some poems.
Yeah.
About actually, it's in a poem that's in ModPo about a woman who needs to end a pregnancy and what it's like in the 1930s to do that.
So is this sort of like, has he been sold an American version of like male living that he's like, you're gambling?
Absolutely.
Yeah, and that's what he's trying to kind of live up to. But is that the certain way he's trying to live his life that he thinks he's doing it all right because that's the vision that he's meant to be living up to?
And that's what happened in the 20s. Not only did the dollar get inflated and the stock prices got inflated, but our American sense of invulnerability after the disaster of Europe, the dollar was strong and you could do whatever the fuck you wanted.
Okay.
But I think with the context we have as to Fearing's politics and his place in the New York left, I think we can say that this is tongue-in-cheek. that he's mocking.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
I think that should be said.
But he's mocking what's the...
He's like mocking the
this pretension.
machismo.
Yeah, because how did Fearing live his life?
Well, I think he was a little bit of a
He was
charming
pretty
guy.
rakish. Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
he was a bit...
You know what he did in the 1940s?
What's
What's that?
You know.
No, please.
Oh, he wrote like a hard-boiled detective
that's
novel.
right.
Hey, oh,
Yeah,
cool.
Which is-
screenplays,
Chandler-esque kind of-
noir screenplays.
That's actually worth noting. That's
Hey.
the only Fearing that's in print. That's the New York Review of Books has like a
Yes.
they've redone his hard-boiled stuff.
Yeah,
You can't
from
find
the-
his poetry.
From the post-war period, I don't know, I think his politics were supposedly had moved rightward from far left or to the center, but actually they hadn't. So there's a lot of evidence. And there's a book by Rita Barnard, who's a colleague of mine here at Penn, Barnard. I think it's all Fearing, or maybe it's a third Fearing. Anyway, Fearing is a big part. And she addresses the later work, but also the poetry, which nobody really had written about, partly because of that thing that I reminded us of at the beginning, which is, the Fearing of the 30s got wiped out, even though he was probably the most popular of all the poets. Certainly he survived better than Horace Gregory did poetically.
In Horace Gregory and Maria Zatroneska's book, they wrote together the history of American poetry, 1900 to 1940. He says that Fearing is the proletarian poetry poet. Like, he's the one that will be remembered.
Which is really an unorthodox view, because at the time they're writing in 40, 41, whenever they're writing. It's not far after the 30s, right? And at that point, you would take, Edwin Rolfe for someone who's writing a socially descriptive, realistic, narrative, character-based poetry of the sort that nobody here at the Kelly Writers House would be interested in anymore, if I can say that, almost comically, right? That was the kind of, come on, you can do better than that. Right, and then we go scurrying off to see if Gertrude Stein can be read as political.
Okay, yeah,
right?
yeah.
Right, so that kind of argument got played out in the 30s, and here's Horace Gregory saying, no. Fearing is going to be the one. And in fact, through Ginsberg, Fearing is the one. Final thoughts on this hilarious little bit of 30s poetry. Anybody got one? Sorry to spring that on you.
I would say, just to sort of full circle to what Iain was saying at the beginning about talking about these issues we have now about violence in poetry, and I've been thinking a lot lately about, there's the Brecht poem that's like, you can't write about the trees when the woods are filled with soldiers, that sort of idea. And I love poems that don't ignore the issue at hand, but play with it in such an interesting way. And so to sort of take a comic, like, vernacular and apply it to a suicide during the Great Depression is such a genius idea. It really is. And it shouldn't necessarily work, but maybe because the idea is so good and he's such a talented poet, it really does come together. It's wonderful.
Yeah, and but probably just like building on what you're saying, like the fact it's called Dirge, and then it's the most hilarious, rollicking poem, like, from start to finish, this sort of woo bonk, like it's just like it's not a dirge.
No, it's not. In fact, that's my final thought. Dirge. I mean, I have to find a metapoetic quality to every poem that I talk about. I just do. It's in my bones. But that's the metapoetic aspect here, because dirge is a genre or a subgenre, right? And so what is this? This is an elegy, right?
Yeah.
Of sort. And it's so not elegiac.
Yeah.
So he's really taking a poetic category, and he's blowing it up. And the most radical thing about this poem is, in fact, the mismatch between the genre of dirge at a time when, this is before we start getting mass killings in the 30s in Europe, and long enough after the mass killings of mostly not Americans, mostly Europeans, and add some Australians to that and some Indians and so forth, but Americans as well in World War I, far enough away from that mass killing you've got the most tragic thing that we have, which is the stock market crashes and dozens of people who are now worthless and can't take care of their families kill themselves. That is a mass killing. The market killed these men, mostly men. Yeah. And so taking Dirge and turning it around is a radical thing.
Yeah. And also, like, would Dirge have been in usage at that time as, like, oh, God, that's a Dirge, that's a boring, like,
slow,
hard,
minor,
tedious kind of... Oh, yeah.
Slow step along the street.
Yeah.
Yes.
But I kind of, it's got a kind of turgidity in it in the word as well.
Yes,
yeah, the sort of bathos of all of that.
Yeah, where are the bagpipes?
Yeah, yes, where are the bagpipes? Well, still Louis McNeice has to bring them.
Are you homesick for the bagpipes?
I hear enough bagpipes. I can live another couple of weeks without bagpipes.
John, thank you so much for traveling all the way from Massachusetts to talk about these poems. And Iain,
yeah,
it's a bonus that you got to join us.
Bonus for me. Great to meet John and like have my eyes and ears open to this new poetry that I didn't know, and to learn a bit more about this interesting country that we're in.
I challenge you the next time you're back home in Edinburgh doing a reading to say, I'd like to close tonight by reading Dirge by Kenneth Fearing.
Okay,
I dare
I'm not sure if I'm accepting the challenge or not. I'll think about that.
I wonder what they would say. Thank you both so much. This was great.